Hello, and welcome to this event on confronting marginalization in climate action and conservation. My name is Thiago Kanashiro from Chatham House, and I'll be one of your chairs with Helen Tugendhat from Forest Peoples Program. I've been asked to make a few housekeeping announcements. Firstly, this meeting is on the record, so it's not under the Chatham House rule. You're very welcome to repeat what you hear here and who said it. This event is part of the London Climate Action Week 2023 and aims to expose and eliminate the structural barriers that hinder marginalized communities from exercising their full power in the face of climate vulnerability. The impacts of climate change and biodiversity loss are felt most acutely by the world's most vulnerable populations. Often, these are the same marginalized groups such as women, indigenous peoples, Afro-descendants, ethnic minorities, and other customary rights holders in the Global South. In this event, we'll delve into cultural and socioeconomic disparities in climate action and conservation, and strategize ways to address climate vulnerability and biodiversity loss in global hubs, such as in London, in Accra, in N'Djamena, Nairobi, to name a few. We also explore the crucial role of direct finance to indigenous peoples and local communities in achieving climate and biodiversity justice. Our panel of speakers will each deliver initial remarks for around 6 minutes each, addressing two basic questions. Firstly, within the so-called community or communities, which groups are the most marginalized in discussions about climate change and biodiversity loss? And second, what strategies are they employing to confront marginalization in conservation and climate action? After their remarks, we'll open the floor for a dynamic Q&A session, and you're very welcome to start populating our Q&A box with your own questions, which we'll handle later on. Now, without further ado, let me hand over to our co-chair, Helen.
Hello, everybody, and I'd just like to join my voice to Tiago's to say welcome from the Forest Peoples Programme. We're really excited to be co-hosting this panel discussion during London's Climate Action Week, and we're really excited about the lineup of speakers that we have to speak to you today. I'm going to be introducing each of the speakers quite briefly, but if you pay attention to the chat box, you will see much more detailed bios about the roles and responsibilities that these speakers have. And I'd very much suggest reading those as you're listening to their remarks. So the first speaker that I would like to introduce today is Daryl Bozu, who is the Deputy National Director of Arocha, Ghana. Daryl, you have the floor. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Helen and Thiago, and it's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to contribute to this very important discourse. And I might say, to really get into the matter, without wasting time, I would say that in talking about marginalized groups and in looking at the sense of who is actually compromised in terms of their livelihood, in terms of their access to certain biocultural sites and all of that, we then have to also ask ourselves what kind of interventions that our government and investors and businesses are undertaking that has potential to contribute to climate action and also biodiversity conservation. And to discuss that in Ghana, I will use Ghana as an example, and I'll say in Ghana, our government has been focusing a lot around mitigation actions. And not only that, we've also seen a lot of activities from civil society, a lot of investors really looking at mitigation actions across the country, where we have seen communities being facilitated and supported to put their community lands under sustainable forest management. And bear in mind that these areas are also the areas where these communities farm for crops, for food, and also most of these areas are also the same areas that these projects are also intended to happen. So when you look at the conservation and in terms of mitigation actions in particular, we've seen a lot of forests. Ghana, for example, is implementing two projects, which is looking at mitigation actions. There's a Ghana Cocoa Forest Emissions Reduction Program, which is actually looking at working with cocoa farmers to more or less integrate more trees on their cocoa farms, whilst also increasing emissions reductions within the landscape in exchange for some financial returns. And this is actually one of the first RED programs that is running in the country. Again, we have what we call the Ghana Share Landscape Emissions Reduction Program running in the Savannah ecozone of the country, where we've seen communities who usually go out there, particularly women, go out to collect share nut, are now being facilitated and supported to also undertake certain activities like restoration activities, enrichment planting, and all of these towards contributing certain mitigation actions. And towards actions on mitigation also, we've seen the state and our government also ramp up a lot of activities in relation to energy efficient systems, and also even looking at an energy transition. As we speak, Ghana has developed an energy transition framework, which is looking at from the year 2020 right up to 2070. And it's quite broad in scope and looks at the various ways Ghana can leverage the opportunities for climate action and within the energy transition sector. So in terms of marginalization, some of the key people or the key sectors or groups that we see that mostly become, I would say, become marginalized as a result of a lot of these initiatives that we see are communities, mostly communities that are living close to some of these areas. And in certain cases, we've seen that certain projects have had to go through seeking consent from communities, seeking consent for certain activities to be undertaken. And when these activities actually happen in terms of reducing emissions or reducing deforestation, we also see that there has been some indirect impact on communities where their livelihood activity has to be suspended, or we have to get them onto new alternatives, most of which do not necessarily bring them the commensurate economic benefit and incentives that they expect to have. We've also seen women groups in most of these communities come under pressure, because in Ghana, for example, our communities and landscape is mostly patriarchal, and we have leadership being led by the men in most instances. So when it comes to issues of protecting bicultural assets, securing biodiversity, as well as climate-related interventions, we see that the involvement of the women is very limited. Decisions on water protection in cases where actions to, for example, have access to certain minerals to address the energy transition challenges, see communities have their water resources affected or polluted. And most of the time, before even these projects get started, they are not consulted on these. We have also seen some CSOs and also to a large extent, the civic space with which communities and also a lot of groups operate also become marginalized, but mostly because the state has responsibility at international level for planning and also implementing a lot of the climate-related action and interventions. It's also the same thing we see when it comes to biodiversity conservation. And that is where we see that when the state decides, citizens and also civil society can speak up, all right, but the state eventually has the final say. So we have seen instances where CSOs have had to come up with shadow reports on issues relating to climate action, sometimes on biodiversity concerns, but these shadow reports are not integrated into the national reporting that is done to the international community. So we have a lot of instances where you only see the state, which we sometimes forget is led by some political actors, already pushing a political agenda, leaving the real interests of the people on the sideline. And that usually can be also an area where we see a lot of challenges popping up for communities, for women's groups, and also for other civil society actors or citizens working within that space. What strategies have we as an organization or even used over time to deal with some of these marginalization that we see in our landscapes and also across the country? I think a lot of the work that we have been doing for a long time has sought to actually empower communities with skills to mobilize themselves for self-governance of their natural resources through facilitation of community-led collaborative resource management strategies. And mostly for these things to work, you need to actually help build the capacity of these people in the knowledge of existing legal policies and frameworks. You build their capacity also in terms of leadership skills and all of that. So they can self-actualize in terms of taking control and managing their own resources without having to wait for other entities or actors from the external coming to really determine for them what they should do with their biocultural assets. And this is how sometimes we've been able to get some of the communities to stand firm, even in the face of certain practices that could seem to be providing some good option for climate action, but in the long run could have some negative effect. And to make a mention of a very specific case, I talk about the ongoing need for much more accelerated exploration of transition minerals, which has put several communities actually on the alert because a lot of their rich ecological landscapes have come under threat. We need the minerals for the energy transition, but at the same time, we are seeing that more and more community and social safeguards are coming under threat. And to also do and also assist with helping to address the marginalization, we've sought to also provide technical facilitation and guidelines to support some of these communities so that they can effectively engage with first the government and also engage with corporations through the articulation of their rights, both environmental and social. And we have had a case in point where we had to actually help communities to take and invoke their rights as specified in our constitution, where we've seen that the government did not actually undertake steps to ensure free, prior, informed consent for certain initiatives, though it's meant to contribute significantly to climate action, are not eventually going to inure to the benefit of the people. We have also had to recently look at engaging with investors, particularly some very big national and also international corporations. And we engage with investors by using both national and international environmental and social safeguard standards and protocols, particularly for climate-related actions like transition mineral exploration, which has the potential for to present I'll say risks to both the present and also future generations, particularly when these exploration of minerals are not done in a way that really helps to safeguard the interests of some of these communities. Again, another important strategy that for us has been very crucial. A lot of these businesses and corporations that are going on and endeavors that are being exploited, we see that there's a lot of financial backing for some of these processes. So how do we effectively engage the financial sector to ensure that they really promote sustainable finance mechanisms to actually support, and where there are instances where certain interventions are not supporting the protection of rights and social safeguards, the financial institutions can even consider or rearrange their investment and really do the needful to ensure that environmental and social safeguards of some of these communities are protected. So in respect of the marginalization and also some of the strategies, I would say this has been some of the strategies we have used over time to try and get action at both national and also at international level to address them. I will end here, and I'm looking forward to also giving some feedback as necessary. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Daryl. Thank you for the comments, and also for the focus on national level action, which I think is a really important place to start when we're talking about climate and conservation action. We'll be hearing also about action on other levels, on regional levels and on international level, but hearing about the work done on the national level as a place to start is really important. It's also really fantastic to hear about climate action and conservation or biodiversity action being thought about in the same breath, so being done in conjunction with each other. And I think that might be a topic that we come back to as we work our way through the panel. But thank you very much for opening the panel discussion. And I'd like to move on to our second speaker. Our second speaker is Ramsin Kamushu, who is the Research Director at Impact Kenya, which is a fantastic organization based outside of Nairobi. Ramsin, you have the floor for your opening remarks. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. And good evening, good morning, and hi everyone. My name is Ramsin Kamushu, as you've heard. I am from Kenya. I work with a local non-governmental organization known as Impact, operating basically in northern Kenya. I am a Maasai, and so I believe I am an indigenous person. In terms of marginalization, I will talk about marginalization. To me, I view marginalization in very broad perspective. And when I talk about marginalization, I see it from the international level all the way to the grassroots. And when I always try to look at this in terms of the international level, there are decisions that are taken and given priorities in terms of the things that people do in terms of nature. There is also marginalization in terms of nature and approaches and discussions. And when we're dealing about climate discussions and climate, coming up with climate strategies to combat climate change, I think we also need to talk about we also need to talk about all landscapes and ecosystems. We try to see what the international negotiations and the donors prioritize and the philanthropists who are putting these funds into place. In terms of funding, there's marginalization that people are focusing more on flourishing ecosystems. And I think for us, that's something that is in the first context that the international spaces also have their own kind of marginalization. I'm only mentioning that as an example because when we try to see there are areas that are being marginalized, even if they are dry, such as deserts, arid and semi-arid lands, we need to focus also in those, because when we don't focus in those areas, the communities that are living in those areas will now migrate to the flourishing ecosystem and cause them to have a lot of degradation, which now will pose more and more challenges to the climate change. That's just an example. And then again, when we try to look at it in terms of how funds are distributed to support fighting climate change, it's also focusing in those areas and neglecting other areas, neglecting livelihoods from those other communities and things like that. And when we, when I leave the international spaces and come to Kenya, for example, where I come from, the marginalization also continues to be here where we are. We see the marginalized groups in Kenya are more so the pastoralists, and we believe the marginalized are the indigenous peoples who live in all those spaces where we have arid and semi-arid lands. We also have marginalized within marginalized. We have smaller groups within marginalized communities. It's good because in Kenya, they are named marginalized communities. So we have like the Maasai are part of the marginalized communities, the Sambu, the Rendile, and such communities living in those closed districts where we have land not registered and open lands for pastoralism. And then when we go to those communities, we also have marginalized within marginalized, and these are small groups living within the marginalized group. When we go to the Maasai community, for example, we have the people known as the Ndorobo, for example. They do not have livestock. These are people who are forest dwellers. They live in the forest and they depend on the forest for their livelihood. So those are also marginalized within the marginalized. We also have women. In most cases, women are not listened to, but they also contribute a lot in terms of climate change and actions that are also can support, if supported, they can really help in terms of climate change, fight. And what are we doing? We are working now here in Kenya with communities. For example, I work in Kenya, and we are supporting to build the recognition of the communities that we are working with, to build their voices through building their capacity to be able to voice out their issues and their challenges, and also to participate in a number of actions that needs to be done, what needs to be done at the community level, and also engaging in policy processes, in the development of policies, and also the implementation of policies. At the regional and international level, we are also injecting our voices to make sure that our voices are listened and our knowledge is tapped and put into place when it comes to national, regional, and international negotiations around climate change and also biodiversity protection. For example, Right now, we are implementing the Inclusive Conservation Initiative program, which is giving communities a priority to put their knowledge into conservation actions and support any kind of framework to support the frameworks within the government also to make it work better.
Thank you very much, Ramson. Thank you very much for those opening remarks. And the Inclusive Conservation Initiative that was mentioned near the end is an initiative by the Global Environment Facility that is looking to try and experiment with more direct financing for Indigenous peoples and for local communities. And it's an initiative that's worth looking into in a little bit more detail. Ramson sits on the steering committee for the Inclusive Conservation Initiative. I also wanted to mention that the more detailed bio for both Daryl and for Ramson is now available in the chat if you'd like to have a little bit more detailed look at that. I wanted to highlight in particular the nuance that Ramson introduced to the idea of who is marginalized and how, and that women, youth, elders, other groups within communities experience separation from power or marginalization in different ways. But he also really importantly pointed to the fact that a diversity of groups and communities have very distinctive contributions to climate action and to biodiversity. In particular, he mentioned women and their role with traditional knowledge, and the same is also the case across other groups within communities. So thank you very much, Ramson, for introducing that nuance, which I think is really important as we continue to work through the inputs on this panel. So that then gives me the opportunity to introduce our third speaker, and I'm really very pleased to be introducing Hindu Umru Ibrahim to speak to us all today. Hindu has many roles, which you'll see pop through in the chat at the moment, including being the coordinator of the Indigenous Women and Peoples Association of Chad. Hindu, you have the floor for your opening remarks. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Ellen, and thank you, Chatham House, and also your organizations who invited us to this panel. And I'm so pleased to be with all the fellow panelists here. It's really very important to have this discussion about the marginalized communities. And I jump directly to what my brother Ramson said. They are marginalized communities, and within them, there are other marginalized peoples inside. So I'm coming from Mbororo pastoralist communities. My people is still nomadic, 100% around Chad, Cameroon, Central African Republic, Niger, Nigeria, even Sudan, and now to DRC. So in my peoples, some of them are semi-nomadic and get sedentarized in some places because they lost their cattle. And that's mean when you are having a different life and livelihood, for sure you can be marginalized by the majority of the groups. And I'm going to give you the examples concretely in myself when I was growing up and I was going to school. So when I sit in the school, the kids don't want to sit next to me. They just say like, oh, she's smiling milk. Because only I'm coming from a nomadic communities who are a cattle herders. And then while I'm kids, I'm like, oh, I'm not showering with the milk. Why they say I'm smiling milk? And then when I start growing up, I realized how much I was lucky to go to school to understand the marginalization that my community are facing. And then that also pushed me to create the organizations to fight for the girls who have my age because we have been marginalized. And I realized I cannot talk about the human rights or girl rights without talking about the community rights, because it is the entire community who was marginalized. And then immediately I understood I cannot talk about the human rights without talking about the environment right, because we live and depend from the environment. And then if we do not protect it, we will be more marginalized on it. So within the group, you can see like the level of marginalization who can come from when you are kids, when you become a woman, and then the entire communities. And as the peoples who have a different lifestyle, as an indigenous communities, a pastoralist, so for us, we are seeing ourselves, we are living in harmony with the nature. And other people are seeing us, you are not a primitive peoples because you are not coped with the development. but they do not understand this development who put us in this climate change pathway. It is not like a place where everyone can sit and then keep our life healthy. So then if like we depend from the nature, we get everything from the rainfall, and then we get the climate to become more like serious in our communities with a bigger floods, or with less rain who can create a more drought. So then the extreme weather events impact our life and livelihood. And then it's impact the life of community to become doubly marginalized because of our life and livelihood who become shrink by the climate change impact. And then the other crises come one after another. When you got flood or drought, of course, the food insecurity is impacted, your economy is impacted, people get fighting to get access to the natural resources, you get into the conflict between communities, etc., etc. And at the end of the day, of course, you become really marginalized within the majority, and the responses do not go to you. So that led me to say, like, how we can change the world and include the communities who live, depend from the nature, who have been marginalized because of their way of life, but who now giving the world, the entire world, the reality that we are not marginalized, but we are the best people who are protecting the nature. So how they can learn from the marginalized communities to save the humanities. So that's the place where we should focus and look at the positive way of the communities, even marginalized, who can contribute very positively in our life. So in chart, you can see the National Adaptation Plan. We have the mention of the indigenous peoples knowledge, indigenous peoples participations, and then the protections of the nature. And when you come to the international level, you see also how the finance can marginalize the indigenous peoples. And that also led me to the conclusion to say, as indigenous peoples, we set up all together and we look at our way of living, and we look at how the funding are responding to our needs. And we come up with 10 principles. The principles who lead us on how the finance can adapt to our way of life. Is not like us who can adapt to the financial or bankers. And then this way can help us to better fulfill the marginalizations and to better use the wisdom and the knowledge of indigenous communities to all save the nature, the ecosystem that we do have and depend from it. So we can turn the wheel if we want it, but we must listen to the communities who are the most marginalized, include them in the decision making, and adopt to the needs of the community, not make the communities adopt to the needs of those who are in the city and design the solutions for the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hindu. And I think the final point that you ended on there is incredibly important when we start thinking about direct financing and who is being expected to adapt to whose way of thinking when financing is being discussed and thought about. I also wanted to highlight a link that you drew, which I think is a really critical one, between the enjoyment of individual rights and the enjoyment of collective rights within a community. I think that link between individual and collective rights is incredibly important when we're talking about ways of life and livelihoods, and is not always highlighted. Finally, I just wanted to quickly recognize the link that you drew between understanding and recognizing the values and the contributions that Indigenous peoples and that local communities make, while simultaneously recognizing vulnerabilities that are created or that exist for resource-dependent livelihoods. I think recognizing empowerment and vulnerabilities at the same time is a really crucial part of understanding the policy steps that we need to collectively take. So with that, I'm really pleased to turn to our fourth speaker on our panel, and then we'll move into our more interactive Q&A session. Our fourth speaker, we're really pleased to be able to welcome Jenny Lopez, who is a land governance advisor with the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office here in the UK. Jenny, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Helen. And of course, I'm coming from quite a different perspective to the other speakers we heard, and I think it is much to hear as speak as well. So as Helen said, I work for the UK government, but I think I've been invited here because, as well as to speak from that donor funding perspective, the UK was also very involved in leading the launch of the Indigenous People and Local Communities Forest Tenure Pledge at COP26, and the ambitions to increase direct funding that is reaching IPLCs. So this issue of how donors and funders, and in particular bilaterals, can provide more effective direct support to IPs and LCs is a very live, and I think an issue that has been really escalated to those of us working in land governance and forest tenure over the last 2 years. The pledge, which was for 1.7 billion, was very much to raise that visibility and momentum and increase the amount that donors are funding IPLCs and forest tenure work. But more critically, it really stemmed from that recognition by donors that funding is not reaching communities, forest communities, communities on the ground, in so much as getting lost to the implementing organisations. It's getting lost through multilateral funds. There's a really big gap in how it's reaching communities on the ground, how it's being spent, how donors are aware of and understanding how it's being spent. So just as much as the amount itself, it was about how we can increase collaboration among funders themselves, but among funders and wider stakeholders, the implementing organisations, the local communities, the Indigenous communities themselves, how we can better work together and really increase understanding and open up that dialogue to make those mechanisms more effective. So there's a real recognition, I feel, and I really feel since the pledge has been launched, that there has been a shift in this understanding, and I think a lot more of a humbleness among donors and about how we need to work together to support marginalised communities more effectively. And I think particularly bilaterals, there really are significant funding barriers in the way bilaterals are able to fund and support different types of organisations. And to be very honest, I think we're all aware our funding systems are not set up to provide direct support, particularly to smaller organisations where it is really hard to meet certain restrictions and requirements. So a core ambition is to really, I think, recognise and learn where this discussion we're having today, there are nuances, it is more complex. When we say we'd like to provide more direct funding, what we're really learning as donors, particularly bilaterals, is that is a lot more complicated, and we want to engage in this conversation about identifying those challenges and barriers. So, for example, as a donor, to try and support communities more directly, there's so many compliance issues, there's so many risk management compliance that we have to take into account, transaction costs, the reporting requirements are really very tough, and this means that the ability of local community organisations to be able to take on those administrative burdens such as reporting is really difficult, to be able to manage that funding at a scale that would really shift the funding that goes directly. So what we're also trying to explore is what could be more effective. Is it more effective to set up other types of mechanisms that might absorb that administrative burden, for example? So, one partner is the Tenure Facility, who is really exploring a way to get funding more directly to communities, even if it is not 100% direct, but where there can be assurances that there's more direct partnerships and that they're acting as a trusted partner. And let's say you've got IPLCs who are on the board or on the governance mechanism. So it's more nuanced than just direct funding. What do we mean by direct funding, and how can we make sure that that's as effective as possible? So it is a collaborative work in progress. I think we certainly need deeper discussion and understanding of direct support, what the purpose of that is ultimately that we're trying to reach. We need, and I think as donors we're recognising, we need better analysis of the types of intermediary organisations, what their role could be. It's a vast spectrum from global organisations to regional to very local organisations. They each have a purpose and role. So how can we better understand that? How can we get better join up between the funding intervention levels, so at regional government, multilateral levels, to get more coordination? I think also what we're learning and what's really exciting about the pledge is it's a collaboration between private and public donors. So again, there's many strengths that philanthropic organisations have in their role at different stages of the funding cycle to bilateral. So really there can be a lot of value in how we can work together to fund different types of projects and build on those strengths. I think also we're recognising a lot more regional dialogue and collaborations needed between donors and wider stakeholders, and that's something we're very actively working on. We can't generalise. There are very specific situations to specific countries, and then even within those countries, you know, that we need to think about collaboration at that regional level, local level, as well as at the bigger global, the wider picture. But yes, really just want to end on that point of needing this constructive dialogue between, you know, all the way across stakeholders from donors to IPLCs. Really welcome this discussion we're having today. I think we all do share, and I think we're at a point we do have those shared ambitions and goals to make this more effective, but I think where we're at now is needing to really break down that direct funding. We keep using that phrase, but what does that really mean when we're saying that? Perhaps we're meaning more direct funding rather than direct funding itself, if we're to touch upon achieving this at scale and really supporting some of the local communities we're talking about in a way that they're able to most effectively get the money at the ground to achieve our shared ambitions of, you know, let's say biodiversity goals, livelihoods. I think there are many different models that can be of value that we need to keep working on together. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jenny. And it was really great to hear you end again with reference to conservation, biodiversity and climate, because those are the shared long-term impacts that we're all looking at. I'm sure there's going to be a really interesting discussion on direct financing. And I think it's important that you highlighted something that was also mentioned in the remarks that Hindu gave, that there is no one solution to the direct financing conundrum of how to improve and how to increase direct financing to Indigenous peoples and to local communities. So I'm really excited to hear what questions come back from the audience, and then also a further discussion between the panelists on this really important topic of direct financing. So with that, I'll hand back to Tiago for the next stage of the panel discussion.
Thank you, Helen, and for the initial remarks by you, Hindu, Daryl, Ramson, Jenny. Thank you very much for that. And for the participants, please do populate our Q&A box. I will just kick off with 2 small blocks of questions. The first block to Hindu and Ramson, and the second one addressed to Daryl and Jenny. The first one to Hindu and Ramson. I would like to ask you to help me understand how you articulate visions of climate and biodiversity justice, or in other words, what does climate and biodiversity justice look like to you? And picking on one of the projects, Ramson, you mentioned on the Inclusive Conservation Initiative program, I wonder if that's one of the positive experiences you would like to expand on and share how it has been evolving, or if in your communities, both Hindu and Ramson, there would be other positive experiences that you can share with us. And if I may, Hindu, if you could start.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so climate and biodiversity justice for us, it's very important as coming from the communities. We are the one who are protecting the nature. We are the one who are the guardian of the ecosystem, without reminding all time that we are protecting 80% of the world's biodiversity, but we do have to protect our ecosystem. That what give us wisdom, give us food, give us medicine, give us all what we have. And when we see all our biodiversity that we are losing from all the different species, we are seeing how we are becoming impacted by the climate change. This is in fear and justice that we are facing. So to fill the gap for the climate and biodiversity justice, it is a recompensations. And that's why, like in the climate negotiation, we have the loss and damage for the first time recognized under the negotiations. So how the loss and damage can recognize the economic and non-economic losses and damages for our communities when it's become to the extreme weather event, from the drought to the floods, how it can build a direct access finance to preserve the biodiversity, because when we lose the biodiversity, for my people, we are losing the medicine that we are using. We are losing the food that we are using. We are losing our land that we are born on it, grow on it, and that we are growing all our knowledge there. And when it's become to the climate change, it is the same. We are losing our cattle. We are losing all our identity, actually, our culture. So how this can be reconstructed and can be recompensated. We cannot pay the life or all what we are losing, but recognizing it and recompensating it, this is one of the justice that we can pay. Second, how we can build all the responses with our people together. When we have the climate response, we have the biodiversity response, the plan, the program that have been discussed at the international level through the different conventions. And when it's become to the national level, turn it into the law, legislations, or programs, how our peoples can take the seat while it is designing, not just to be a beneficiaries, because we are not a beneficiaries. We are actors that are responding, protecting, while they are just like sitting and talking. So we must take the decision together from the beginning. And that's also another way of justice. And finally, how the direct access finance, as Jenny said, bilaterally, yes, it can work, but also by group, it could also work. How the funding can pass directly to our communities. It's not like the funder or the financial partners who can design the way because they think that they get the finance. They should think about the ecological debt that they have vis-a-vis to us. It is about ecological debt. They do have finance. The noun, it's not a charity that we are asking. It is a right. So they must understand that the community who are receiving to do not put in the way you are recipient, we are donors, or whatever. We are all same because we are protecting the nature, that you benefit from the nature and you become rich. So how this financial gap can be designed together with the communities without the requirement of a lot of criteria that we have to reach, but understanding our own criteria that we are setting up. And I will be posting in the chat like the 10 principles of the indigenous peoples that we agree on it, then everyone can read them. And those are the principles we are asking, very simple one, not complicated. Thank you.
Thank you, Hindu. That's very straightforward. Thank you for that. Ramson.
Thank you so much. I think I will support my colleague Hindu. We've always been in these negotiations together, and for us, we view things probably differently than how other people view. For example, when I talk, when I mention a little about climate justice, I'll go again from the international level and coming down. When I try to see the negotiations and how the world is, the international community is going as per the laws, putting strategies on combating climate change, and for example, making eco-fuels such as petroleum and that kind of fuels very expensive, is also not the best way that we can see it's climate justice. For us, we can say that that one is also putting vulnerable communities into more vulnerable nature, because the best way to approach it is to bring in solutions or alternatives that can now control people from using the biofuels, but not making it very expensive, because it will make livelihoods within our own community more expensive. Fuel is increasing every day here, for example, in Kenya, and the people living in very remote areas are now finding it hard for them to transport goods and commodities in the language that it's a way to combat climate change. And that one is not really justice. Even if you bring all the funds and giving, incentivizing people in terms of carbon credits and things like that, I think the best way is to even, I think when I look at the other way, it's giving a lot of funds to the people who are producing this biofuel, this crude oil, I mean petroleum, and they could also monopolize a lot of businesses and control and continue to produce more. So I think it's making them easy to produce more and do a lot of industries. Other than, I think it should be made very cheap in a way that they could not produce and sell more, and look for alternatives to combat climate change. But away from that, I will also say in terms of the projects that we are doing, yes, ICI could be one of the best alternatives, inclusive conservation initiative, where we are trying to recognize the homegrown solutions in terms of biodiversity protection and conservation of nature. We recognize the indigenous people's efforts and welcoming other, we try to decolonize conservation. By decolonizing conservation, we give a room for the indigenous people's knowledge to come into play. I think it has been neglected by the world for so many years. And I think when we give this the chance to play, I think it will now become available for other peoples to use. And we're also so much encouraging the researchers to work with communities and also to integrate the indigenous people's knowledge and their scientific knowledge, because we are not fighting any, but we want both of them to coexist and support each other. The other thing is in terms of resource mobilization and putting direct finances to the communities. We have one project that we are doing with the Netherlands government. It's known as Reversing the Flow, which we are going back to the communities and ask the communities what they want to do to make their livelihoods better in terms of preservation of nature and anything around biodiversity protection, and receiving the funds from the Netherlands government and give directly to the communities to implement their own programs. So Impact and any other organization is not part in between, but supporting communities directly to own these projects and implement them by themselves. This way, we'll also give them an upper hand of owning and continuing projects that they have been doing even beyond the project period. The other thing is a lot of people are also talking about commodification of nature. And I think this one is around nature, giving nature credits and biodiversity credits. For us, we are thinking about recognition of the indigenous peoples and local communities who have been living in nature. And for nature to get its value, you have to work with the indigenous peoples and local communities and let them show you how they can value nature. Nature, to us, biodiversity is so diverse, and all plants and animals are not the same, but they give life. Some plants are so important to us, they are herbs, some are food, some are our shrines for praying, and we give them a bigger and a better value than any other plant that's just there and giving carbon sinks. In the same case to wildlife, some wildlife animals are competitors, just like human beings, needing food in the biodiversity, such as elephants, but some are food sources, such as bees, and also pollinators. So we give them also a bigger value than a competitor who is there in the land. So I think for us to commodify nature and giving nature value, we also need the recognition. That's how we would say that climate justice is recognized, according to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramson. That made me think of a few questions as follow-ups. And thank you very much for Molly, Alexandra, Benjamin for the questions directly in the Q&A function. Please, for the other participants, please do send your own questions. As I promised, I only have this final round of questions to Daryl and Jenny, and then I'll pick up those questions coming directly from the participants. First to Daryl. You've been working on the conservation space in Ghana for a while, and I understand you run an important campaign working with small farmer and peasant communities around the Ateo forest range, and also trying to engage more closely with local communities and younger peoples around the forest, who often find the only alternative in terms of livelihood once they are displaced because of mining sites. They often find their only alternative engaging with illegal mining, for instance. I wanted, if possible, for you to bring some of the solutions that Russia Ghana have been putting in place. And to Jenny, Hindu and Ramson, they mentioned a few elements that they find important for their communities that would have to do with decolonizing conservation and the issues around marketization or commodification of nature. And I wanted to learn from you how you think donors face this challenge of addressing this call from the ground for an approach that would be decolonial. And also, how do you see the balance between international cooperation tackling sustainable commodities and sustainable imports of certain commodities that are sort of wanted in certain geographies compared to the approaches that would be more focused on human needs, human rights, and on land tenure, land security, as some of the speakers mentioned before. I wanted to have an understanding of how do you see the challenges for donors to be processing such kinds of requests from indigenous communities and local peoples. And Dario, can you start, please?
Thank you, Thiago. And to answer the question, I think we all recognize the increasing unemployment rate in the region. And that said, also, we see an increasing trend where political leaders are actually pushing for much more short-term initiatives and not thinking about the long-term sustainability of their government, because they want to show to the electorate that, look, I can do something for you within this term of my office. So we've seen a lot of pressure, and this pressure is being manifested in a lot of young people really going down to the ground and taking advantage of the opportunity created by the politicians, the narrative that you can actually mine your way out of unemployment. So we see young people going into the forest reserves, getting into certain engagement where they are digging and mining for gold, mining for some minerals to be enable them to actually meet their livelihood needs. And what we have seen, has been a big challenge in respect to that is that whereas we see some dedicated effort from our political leadership in Africa, for example, pushing for the narrative of mining because it brings very immediate revenue and income to communities, we are not seeing an increase in investment in the green options, which will provide long-term well-being and support and also mechanisms in terms of safeguarding the environment and safeguarding the rights of people who live close to resources. I say this because mining, as we know, comes to displace several other services. Mining activities, as it's done, the illegal activities come to displace water services, come to displace farming, land for farming activities. It's even come to displace biodiversity habitat. So if we see a commensurate investment by stakeholders, by investors, by government, and green development pathways, that for us present the opportunity to actually take these youth who are now more oriented toward short-term livelihood interventions like mining to more long-term sustainable interventions that bring benefit not just for present generation, but also for future generation. So what we have been doing in these years in the landscape that we work is actually try to work with both bilateral agencies and development partners to actually highlight and also undertake assessment and put on the agenda the need and the prospects of the green models and the green opportunities. So we do that also by having to also drive in and also develop business models that really look at the long-term opportunities within the landscape, hinging it on existing green value chain. So we've looked at high-end timber forest products, working with communities, working with private companies to actually add value to some of these opportunities and helping them to also access market. We've looked at also in terms of research, working with both financial institutions and research institutions to see how even for areas where certain commodities are not identified, we really take the steps to really find these opportunities and then build on them by adding value to these products. So I think this has been quite a very strategic approach, but this has not worked without the support of some of these private companies. So we go into partnership with private companies who are also interested in some of these environmental and social safeguards, and who will bring value to some of these, the landscapes that we work in. And we believe that by focusing, there needs to be a consistent attention and focusing by both government, by both investors, and both the local private companies and international companies, to see how best we can start pushing the agenda on long-term green business value chains, and how we can also bring finance to the people who need it. So I really like the point that Jenny made in the fact that we need to find ways to get direct financing to communities, because they have several beautiful ideas for initiatives that will take them out of unemployment, but they are not getting the necessary financial support. So they end up moving towards these quick, fast cash initiatives like mining, which end up displacing a lot more other people out of their livelihoods and also their access to some biocultural assets within the landscape. So I believe that there needs to be a concerted effort. Government needs to work with financial institutions, and these financial institutions need to collaborate with some of these bilateral agencies. And we have seen a lot of these agencies, like the EU in Ghana is doing that. We are seeing a lot of support also coming from some development-oriented agencies to now focus on green development pathways. And I think this is where we need to start pushing and also changing the narrative towards, in terms of helping to bring livelihoods that support us now and also for the long term.
Thank you, Daryl. If I may pass on to Jenny.
Thank you. And I think, Daryl's covered it from a really, there's a lot of there's a lot in what you've just answered, Alex. So it's a very complex question, of course. I think I agree with Daryl that, there's so many different sorts of projects, different scales of programs we're talking about that that we need to take into account here. So of course you've got, particularly the bilateral, and as Daryl's been saying, you've got the the really large multilateral funds, which we're talking about huge sums of money. We're talking about very different implementation models, through to ways that we're working to support governments, their administrative capacity, through to obviously the grant work, the regional work that we're doing on the ground more directly with civil society organisations and the communities more directly. So of course each of these has very different approaches, and I think the ways that we work through to kind of leveraging and influencing and trying to, as we say, make smaller shifts perhaps in approaches such as the multilateral funds, through to, I think, at the more regional level and some of the smaller programs where we're really able to start to incorporate or try and see how we can have a much more interactive approach. So with the way that those programs are being designed and developed from the start. So Hindu shared some, some of the core principles that are being developed, such as, really making sure that the communities who should be benefiting from these programs are very much involved at the start of those design processes, or that the kind of the needs and the demands are the core basis of the program, rather than as donors us coming in with a fixed model or a fixed idea of what it should be. There's a lot more ability to do that with certain types of programs than others. So I think there's got to be that awareness from the start of the different programs, the different scales we're working at. But yes, there's certainly a role to influence and leverage. Then there's certainly a role to look at what types of programs we're designing in the first place, and how those are taken forward. I think there's certainly, and again, this is another shift I've been seeing certainly within our organisation, is that awareness of that greater need for consultancy right from the start, to involve a wider group of stakeholders right from the start in those programs. I'd say I'm also seeing, and I'm speaking from some of the programs we're taking forward, is not having a one size fits all approach. The working context, if we're taking forward land governance work in Indonesia, is going to be completely different to if we're starting new program work in Brazil or Kenya. So it's, certainly an approach we're looking to take forward in some of our new work, is having that political economy analysis, of really being very specific to the different countries and regions, and the ways that those governments are working with those communities on the ground as well. So again, being really aware of the nuancing, but also the different marginalization and how those political relationships are working, and what opportunities there are in different countries, as well as those different barriers. And I think I'm biased because obviously my work focuses on land and forest tenure security, but I'd really obviously champion that as a really fundamental core critical issue that we need to try and have right and have built in design of programming if we are to make progress on some of those points that you brought in at the start, Tiago, on different commodities, or how we're working with the private sector. If we for example work on responsible land and forest investment, if we haven't got that awareness and we're not getting that understanding of tenure security and rights and the importance of involving communities at the start in any new investment, or whether we're talking about mining or agricultural commodities or forests, that is a core something that needs to be built into programs and funding models as something that we need to work with just the private sector as well as governments. I think tenure security is also it's critical for how we're looking at land use change, how we're looking at being able to even just ensure that the livelihoods has been brought up several times today by Rams and others, but also that just the basic human rights and the safety of the communities that we're looking to protect. So I feel that if we're not getting tenure security of those communities, then any other types of solution and support we're looking to take forward is going to be at risk and potentially unsustainable. So I think there's those kind of critical core issues, and there's kind of smaller wins, but then there's certainly the longer term points as well. And as I say, certainly from the UK side, we're also very aware that the support to the kind of more systemic reform and governance structures and working with governments is also just as important as the work we're taking forward on the ground. So it's, as always, it's a big spectrum. It's never going to be one easy answer.
Sorry, if I can jump here on what Jenny
Please
said.
do, Hindu.
Thank you. So it is important also to do not choose the ecosystems, because that's what we are seeing around the world, especially the indigenous peoples. So all the funding, especially coming from developed world, they wanted to focus to all mitigation, and mitigation for them is the tropical forest. And tropical forest is become again more political. They choose country, they choose region, they choose what they are going to put their money there. At the end of the day, they forget completely the concept of climate change that we are fighting and biodiversity that we are protecting. So if we focus and choose an ecosystem, we will not solve the climate change, we will not solve the biodiversity, and we will not help the communities. So I give you the concrete examples. When there is all the climate change, so I'm in a country who have the 3 different biodiversity. We have 100% desert in the north, we have savanna and then wetland in the center, and we have tropical forest in the south, the place that we are neighboring Central African Republic. So what's happening? People move from the desert to the savannas. People from the savannas move to the tropical forest. And that's how it's happened. We ended up, we have the cattle in the middle of the DRC. So we cannot say we are going to protect the heart of the tropical forest. If we leave the other ecosystem, people will move. People always will move where this is resources. Even they are fighting, dying each other, killing each other, but it is the survival. They are going to move there. They are going to use the resources. So we need to decentralize the activities and decentralize the investment. So we must protect like the oceans, as we must protect the glaciers. We must protect the mountain, as we must protect the savannas and all the desert. So we must protect all of them. You cannot choose if your children are sick, which one that you will take to the hospital and which one that you can let die. So we have to tackle our ecosystem as our own children, and we have to tackle it as our own body. If you have a headache, so that means your feet cannot work, you cannot think, you cannot eat, you can get an stomach who can really paining you. It is the same. If one ecosystem is sick, the rest of the ecosystem also are sick. If you wanted to heal them, we must put the money everywhere. We must to all pass the geopolitical issue and where we wanted to put the money, if we wanted to really to put the communities in front and to put the climate change and biodiversity fight for all the world in the fair way. Thank you.
Thank you, Hindu. And from the chat I'm following here, lots of other panelists are pretty much agreeing with what you're saying, with Helen recalling the saying of the tyranny of the tree when it comes to the favorite child of being the tropical forests. Ransom, you wanted to comment on this, right?
Yes, please. But in point form, I just wanting to support what Hindu is saying. All ecosystems are important. We are seeing, when I began this discussion, I started by saying, I think all ecosystems need to be put in place. And by neglecting ourselves is putting the ecosystems that we are protecting or focusing more into danger, because we will leave all the other ecosystems because they will continue to degrade. No one is focusing into them, and we'll move to the few left biodiversity areas, and we continue to create a mess everywhere. And I think the other thing that we are talking about, the indigenous peoples have been receiving small grants all along for many years, and with a very, very strict reporting schedule. Right now, as indigenous peoples, we are also calling for big grants to be entrusted to us, because we have proved that the small grants that we have been receiving over a period of time have worked. And so we can also make the big grants work. We also need a flexibility in terms of reporting. Some ecosystem, some funds, when you try to implement in dry seasons, for example, you are planting forests and things like that and trying to rehabilitate nature, it does not happen in 1 week. It does not happen in 1 year. You have to have a longer time to show the results of biodiversity rehabilitation. I mean ecosystem rehabilitation. The other thing is about consistency of these funds. Not once and stop. We also want these funds to be consistent, big, long, consistent grants. And also, we're also talking about all regions. Some people, some grants are only focusing different regions, such as Africa or, for example, Asia. But we want all the ecosystem in the 7 biocultural regions of the world to also be focused, and all the indigenous peoples and local communities in those areas to be supported. So we don't want to see, for us, we envisage seeing everyone is included when it comes to the funding, when it comes to the disbursement of funds, and all ecosystems, big fund, consistent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would like to raise 3 questions that came from the participants. One of them is from an anonymous attendee, which I'll read out. The other ones are by Lucia Tremonti and Alexandra Benjamin. For both of you, Alexandra and Lucia, you're more than welcome to join us and read your question using your microphones orally, directly. I'll start with the anonymous attendee's question, and Alexandra and Lucia, please let me know if you would like to pose your question orally, or otherwise I can read it out. So starting with the first question. So do donors, particularly bilateral funders, feel they have an obligation to simplify the reporting processes so local communities and actors have the capacity to receive direct funding? Alexandra, Lucia, you can unmute yourselves.
Hello.
Hi, Alexandra. If you don't mind, raising the question directly, that would be lovely.
Great. So my name is Alexandra Benjamin. I work at an NGO called Fern that focus on forests. And I had a question mostly to Jenny, but if others also have opinions, really happy to hear those as well. We work with a lot of partners across the world. And one of the main issues we have seen is with bilateral funding, there's a lack of flexibility to provide unrestricted funds to national NGOs, but also to indigenous peoples and local communities. And that can sometimes mean that we're funding one-on-one activities, we're funding some tree planting, we're funding some activism, but whilst they're trying to do the activism, their roof collapses or other essential services cannot be covered, like maternity leave. And it can also prevent the long-term financial resilience of these stakeholders because they're unable to build reserves. And when the funding eventually stops, when there's a change in the modality of funding and donors change their strategy, then they have a hard time maintaining the environmental and social gains they have worked on for such a long time. So I was wondering how donors have thought about providing unrestricted funding to these stakeholders, given especially bilateral donors have freedom of information requests and they have the public giving them tax dollars. So it's quite a tricky situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. There's Lucia, please, you can unmute yourself. I'll take this third question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. That was such a fascinating talk. I'm currently doing a master's in social anthropology, and I'm specializing in climate migration from the Pacific. But a lot of what we talked about tonight really resonates with what I'm interested in. And I especially wanted to let you know, Hindu, that your last point on decentralizing investment really resonates with me. I completely agree, especially in climate migration. A largely overlooked part of that is how immobility is as important as mobility. And often those who don't move are amongst the most vulnerable and most marginalized. And it's important to understand how that money is distributed, creating pathways for mobility in financial means, but also investing in those areas where people remain. But I'll stop with that rant. And my question is more about this balance between creating a universal objective of sustainability and climate justice, whilst paying closer attention to the more nuanced and individual marginalized groups' needs, because they're often not the same, as I've discovered in my own research in migration. And how do you suggest we find that balance? And that's directed to everyone. Thank you.
We have 3 questions here. Who would like to start commenting on those?
I see everyone is muted. Jenny, I know that this question, it's to you first, but I wanted to react on the bilateral funding who could be flexible for the organizations. So that is a big caution we are really having. It's a big block is that if there is a funders who wanted to give money, there is always restrictions on it. Other geographical restrictions or other for activities is have to go exactly like for what they asked for. And this is really not work for the era that we are. And actually, it is not only for bilateral, it is also for multilateral. Because the last week finance conference in Paris that organized by Macron, so there was the developing countries, multilateral bank, and then the discussion ended up by the institutions of finance are not adapted to the needs of the countries, not only the peoples. So then there was a proposition of the need to reform all the financial institutions in the world. And then the development bank and also the multilateral bank must discuss together and reform the way that the funding it's working in order to respond to the need of developing nations and to the need of the communities who are the most impacted. So that's very important that the bilateral funding to think about how they can open the restrictions, especially funding the indigenous communities, the local organizations that are working there. And we also know with COVID, we understand none of those systems work at all, because people set up the rules, the box where they have to do the management. And at the end of the day, overnight, when COVID comes, their way is not working, their system is not working. And then they find themselves that if they cannot buy the ticket, pay the per diem and the hotel for the participation for one event, they cannot get the money out. And at the end of the day, how they can just move the money, pay through Zoom or whatever that people can get access and participate to the meeting is become complicated for them. So I think it is time that every funding think about the flexibility of investment for all the communities and for all the world. And finally, to the Sister Lucia, who spoke here on migrations, it is very important what you said, how we can find the balance of sustainability. What is the meaning of the sustainability that can be decentralized for each group? So when now I'm seeing in Chad, we got the refugee coming from Sudan. So you have those refugees who are sitting in the place who are already marginalized. And then if like you have the response humanitarian to the refugees, and then are you going to respond also to the local peoples who are already impacted, or you are only like going to respond to the refugee because your funding is going to the refugees? So what will be the sustainability and the long-term and short-term consequences? So that need really to be tackled between migration, different kind of migration, internally, externally, and different political migration, and define the sustainability is mean for the countries, maybe integration of everything in one. Development, climate, biodiversity, all need to be integrated in order to give a holistic response. And that is the beauty of the indigenous peoples, because we always respond to all the crises holistically. You cannot talk about the climate without talking about education or health, etc. So that needs to be integrated in a bigger scale. Over.
Thank you very much. I think I can also take maybe one or two questions. One is about corruption. Some people mentioned in the text that we also need to fight corruption, and also for us, when we try to look at this as indigenous peoples and local communities, we also want to be keen in this because we are the people who are requesting these direct finances. And in some countries such as Asia, they have the Asian indigenous peoples have already come up with rules and regulations of how to monitor the implementation of funds and how to really be keen in terms of the implementation of funds being implemented by indigenous peoples and local community organizations. This one will also give an advantage that we are also checking on ourselves. We are not only checking on the grants coming from the global level to ourselves, but we're also trying to check that the grants are doing the right things here in the community. And I think it's the same thing that we should be developing also in Africa and also going specifically into countries. In the Inclusive Conservation Initiative program, we now have a whistleblowing, I mean like all the whole system from the community level to the region where the project is operating up to the global level, where we have the communication. Anyone can raise an issue and goes to the different committees all the way to the global level. So those checks and balances can help in fighting corruption when it comes to grants. And I think when there is also a question around the goal and sustainability around climate change, if we can come up with a sustainable, a universal kind of approach when it comes to climate change. Yes, we can have universal approaches, but at the same time, we really value that different places have different actions, because different ecosystems are having actually like different people, and to protect biodiversity, it also means how that biodiversity is important to the community that's living in that area, and what is the kind of livelihood and the connectivity of that biodiversity in relation to the community livelihood. If it really matters a lot with the community livelihood, such as now, when you try to think about protecting nature in pastoral areas, is not the same as protecting nature in areas where we have cities and towns. So different actions in different ecosystems. That one, for me, I cannot go universal as a global. Yes, I can go global, setting universal goals and rules, but when I come to Africa, I have different actions than Latin America and Asia and wherever else in the world. And to talk about one point around donors being flexible, I think that one is a question that's directed to Jenny, but we are also in the receiving end and we are negotiating to donors. And to me, I would say that donors are becoming flexible, and they are not really so strict. They are giving us some flexible grants that according to the challenges we are fighting or we are facing. Sometimes we are facing human rights violations, and sometimes you do not have a human rights violation grant. Those sometimes come in terms of emergencies, because we have communities being evicted out of their lands, but we did not mobilize resources to only stay in our bank accounts in organizations to really wait for that moment to happen. But when we talk about this, we are also approaching different donors and raising such kind of when we raise when we come up with proposals, we also put some kind of funds that are flexible to respond to such issues. When the funds is not used, it's also open for the funds to continue to stay for a bit longer period or to go back or realign to other activities. So that's also something that we are finding it. And during the climate action in Paris, I think, in Marseille, there are also different donors that after saying direct financing, such as the Netherlands government, they also went ahead and developed strategies of putting these resources directly to the communities to do the development of reversing the flow. So I think donors are becoming more and more flexible. And I think by those who are leading in examples, others will also join. And conservation is also taking different approaches. They are now not coming through the normal direct, but they are now going to look for indigenous people's organization and also looking for alternative solutions from the community. So for us, we're seeing that donors are also becoming more and more flexible, and we welcome all to join.
Thank you, Ramson. That's really good to hear. I'm very pleased. But I am aware that I know you've probably been working with those donors a long time, and I know that's probably not the case and not the story that many would also have about that flexibility. So that's really positive, and I think that's an example perhaps. And I think it was really interesting the point you raised that you've managed to demonstrate that how you've managed and are able to make some of these smaller grants work, and then that's acted as a basis to potentially now be able to scale up and move towards larger amounts of funding. And I think ultimately that is a model that we're looking as donors to try and make happen more. And I think that's what we mean by scale up. So whether that's through providing smaller grants initially, which then we can establish relationships and build the capacity of organizations to be able to absorb funding going forward, or whether that's through supporting intermediary organizations and partners who are able to support those organizations to build that capacity to absorb those funding directly. I think that's exactly the type of model or progress or journey that we're wanting to see more of happen. So thank you for that. But to come back to the original question on the flexibility, of course, I think it's recognised that donors need to be more flexible, particularly bilaterals. But I do have to emphasise there still has to be that accountability, and particularly as a bilateral, of course, it is taxpayers' money. It's aid. We really, and if we're going to continue to maintain that and continue to maintain the support from countries, we still have to have that accountability and transparency. Unfortunately, that still does mean reporting, and reporting means administrative burdens. I would say that to some, in many cases, I think through that being a really close relationship with partners, that is also important and beneficial to the organisations themselves, such as to ensure certain checks and balances are in place, as you mentioned, Ramson, on corruption, on ensuring certain risks are always being monitored and taken into account. So that often exists for good reasons. The question also raised about just core support, core needs needing to be met. I mean, actually, I think there's a bit of misunderstanding there. Our funds do support core funding, such as for offices, equipment. There's different types of support and grants. There's accountable grants, there's non-accountable grants. The accountable grants were taken forward at the moment with organisations that is supporting core office costs. So perhaps there's misunderstanding there in different funds to be used, and that is up to there'd be differences in what organisations can fund. But I think we're very aware that, of course, there needs to be training, there needs to be cost. That is part of programmes, and that is certainly part of what we do cover. But yeah, I mean, it's an ongoing conversation between donors and partners. I really liked as well the point you raised, Ramson, about things. It's things change. You know, opportunities come up. There's new risks that come forward, and certainly all the programs that our team are doing, it's very much about that need for being reactive. It's the need to adapt, and that is built into. We know we have regular meetings with partners on how we can, as you say, sort of shift funds where there's new emerging opportunities, that perhaps that's important, and that's not just, you know, that's over the whole course of the program. So I completely support that's critical, and that's certainly something we certainly should be doing more of, is that ongoing reactiveness, that ongoing adaptability. So really support that as well. But yes, I think ultimately, you know, there needs to be more of the flexibility, and that's certainly what I meant at the start by, as certainly as the donors and certainly as the pledge donors, that understanding of more effective mechanisms. And to go back to that point of, it may not always be 100% direct, but more direct. And, you know, as we say, perhaps it is having more of the trusted partners who can absorb some of that administrative and reportive burden to make sure that the core chunk of money is going to the right place and going in the right ways. But I would say that we need a balance of, you know, nearly direct funding as well as 100% direct, depending on the nature of the organisations, until that absorption capacity is reached by the organisations themselves.
Thank you all for this fantastic exchange. And I swiftly pass the baton to Helen for the final remarks on behalf of the hosts. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Tiago. This is a real challenge, 3 minutes for closing remarks on the conversation that we've had today. It's been incredibly rich, and we've covered a huge amount of ground. So if I was going to try to sum up some of the key messages that I've heard today, I would have to start with direct financing. There was really quite a lot of exchange, both from the Q&A that was coming in and also from the responses from panelists. And it was very clear that there's a real consensus among both those asking questions and many of those on the panel about the need to move towards sustained, longer-term impact and trust-based financing. There will be accountability rules attached to that, but the impact that we're looking for is what the reporting should be attached to. Trust-based partnerships over a longer period of time open up possibility for impact, which is simply not possible in shorter term funding. And I think those comments from Ramson and from Hindu and from Daryl and from Jenny support different elements of that. Part of what was also being said with direct financing was listening really carefully to what people are actually asking for. And one of the things that came out really clearly in this panel is the diversity of needs that exist for climate action and biodiversity action, that biodiversity loss is a multi-ecosystem challenge. Climate mitigation is a multi-ecosystem challenge. These actions need to happen in lots of different biomes in lots of different areas in the world. And we need to resist what I've heard called tyranny of the trees, but to really be looking at it at each location where we need to be addressing biodiversity loss. I also wanted to raise a comment that was made by Jenny about tenure security in particular. There was conversation about human rights, individual rights and collective rights from all of the speakers on the panel, but Jenny raised in particular tenure security, land rights. And I think as a proxy or as an example of the kind of human rights that we're talking about when we look at a rights-based approach to either climate action or to biodiversity action, tenure security and land rights is a really critical central right that needs to be part of that conversation. And that's not just an individual right, but it is also a collective right. The final thing that I just wanted to mention was two comments made by Daryl at the very beginning that we didn't return to. One was about the possibility of shadow reporting, civil society and non-state actors reporting against both the biodiversity and climate conventions. I think as a way to drive accountability, it's an example of some actions that could be taken in the future. And the other point was on community consent processes. Daryl mentioned these as a really critical part of how we understand climate mitigation and biodiversity actions on the ground. And we didn't return to it, but I did want to just highlight it again before we said goodbye, because I think those community consent processes will be critical in driving accountability as well. And I think that's just got us to 5:30, and I've snuck in under the 3 minutes. So I'll just close by saying thank you very much to all of our panelists. Your interventions were fantastic, incredibly rich. Thank you for everybody who attended and listened. And of course, thank you to Chatham House for giving us all the opportunity to have this conversation during London Climate Action Week. Thanks very much.